One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we woman and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
Poverty is hell, and the angels are in paradise, driving in their limousine, where everything is nice and clean. Poor man living in a tinny winny hut, children are hungry, nothing in the pot. He gone by the neighbor to beg for some rice. The neighbor under pressure, boy, things ain't nice. He gone in the big shot area to beg. Police put a bullet in the tinny winny leg. He gone in the courts and he lost the case. The prosecutor say he have a bandit face. Poverty is hell. Poverty is hell. Oh, don't you know? Wake up in the morning and the baby cry. The sugar pan empty, the milk bottle dry. The little boy child on the mango tree. The mango green, putting up his belly. The young girl bawling, she wouldn't settle. She whine, she bumsy with stinning nettle. Toilet paper, they never had. They used to do in the gully by the old backyard. They rub she down and they put she to sleep. But the rain come down and the house asleep. Poverty is hell. Poverty is hell. Let the music now. A poor man always dream a lot of dreams. He happy like a puppy when he dream another dream. He dream that he have a new roof on the hut. He dream that he have some good food in the pot. He dream that he have a rich friend named Frank. He dream that he have a lot of cash in the bank. He dream that he pay all his bills for the man. He dream that he have a new car in the front. He dream that he have to go to a vet. He dream that his pocket have a big fat wallet. He wake up in the night and he rush for his pants. All he found in the pocket, a whole lot of hands. Poverty is hell. Poverty is hell. Don't you know? Slice them 10, 10, 10. A piece for a boy and a piece for a girl. A piece for the neighbor daughter moon. You know the cat in the corner looking the best. Little Jack corner kick him in the leg. Go in the room and look for a rat. The rat in the roof, he know about that. Now the cat see a chicky chong, yeah, yeah. He rush for the chicky chong. But the poor little chicky chong away like a chicky chunk, and then cockroach gone in the condensed milk. Mama get vexed for she condensed milk. Who leave the condensed milk open? Come here, you picky head, good for nothing. Mama get vexed and she blood get hot. She drop some lash in the you know what. Poverty is hell. Poverty is hell. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Welcome, welcome to our Open Word podcast, our Monday evening edition of Politics 101. One of the most profound calypsos. Winston Bailey, The Shadow. Poverty is hell. And you know when a calypso is a classic and profound, I can, off the top of my head, think about at least 8 other calypsonians who have quoted Shadow. Poverty is hell. Welcome to today's edition of Politics 101, or Open Word podcast. And we continue to cover poverty. We continue to cover poverty. We continue to talk about poverty. We continue to argue very strongly that the greatest challenge that we face as we go deeper into this era of oil and gas is the challenge of eradicating poverty from the face of our country, and more importantly, from our region. I want to repeat that: from our country and from our region. We are focusing on poverty because we feel that it is central. It is central to this era. It has always been central. But now, in this time of plenty, we are centering poverty and how we deal with it, how we move to alleviate it, to wipe it from the face of our country and our region. Welcome to all of you joining us from Guyana, inside Guyana, those of you who are joining us from our wider Caribbean. We want to stress that this regional focus is not by accident. I know some of you are annoyed at CARICOM for the role that some prime ministers played in the last election, but we have to see that as a hiccup, that our destiny as a Guyanese nation is tied up. It has always been tied up with the Caribbean nation. Welcome to those of you joining us from North America, from Europe. Welcome to Politics 101 this evening. And I want to say thanks to all of you who have sent comments about the programs that we've done on poverty. On Friday, we had Dr. Vincent Adams on, and you all heard him. He said that he was moved to tears on the programs that we've done on poverty because it reminded him of where he came from in Christianborg as a poor boy. You all have heard Professor Thomas talk about the poverty. And so many of you have sent me emails and texts to ask us to continue to focus, because it has brought back memories for those of us who have been able, through opportunities, to move out of the ghetto, to move out of the zone of poverty. And every time we focus on that scourge, I'm glad that it brings back memories. It jolts our consciousness and our conscience. And our conscience, you know, these days they talk about leave no child behind, leave no this behind, leave no that behind. We're saying we want to leave poverty behind. And this is not a slogan for us. This is something that is central to our advocacy, to our vision of where we want to go in the coming period. We are progressives. We have no apologies to make for that. We are progressives. We're not talking here about reforming. We are talking here about fundamental change. Fundamental change, because we have the capacity to do that. And Professor Thomas is here. We're going to start by talking about that auction for the oil blocks and the proposition by the IMF, the suggestion by the IMF that we review our exchange rate. What it means for us if we were to accept the IMF's recommendation. What about the less than sterling response from the oil companies as it relates to the oil blocks? Exxon is at the top there bidding again. So let's talk. Let's talk economics. Let's talk economics 101. Let's talk about oil and gas, and let's talk about, ultimately, poverty. Poverty is hell. It can't be clearer than that. Singing Sanchez talked about the voices from the ghetto. And Shadow, in his skimpy, Shadow doesn't have a lot of fat on his lyrics. Lean, clean. Poverty is hell. 4 little dumpling, mama cutting it in slices. And the dumpling is not only for the children, but it's also the rats and the cockroaches. Only the Calypsonian, the artist, with a keen eye can bring it together like that. Let's talk. Welcome to Politics 101. I see you all are gathering. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Let's bring in Professor Thomas. Professor, good evening.
Good evening, David.
And how are you today?
I'm fine. Thanks very much for asking.
And you, of course, would be familiar with the calypso of Shadow as an economist, listening to the artists singing about economics, singing about poverty.
Poverty, yeah.
Yes. The linkage between art and economics and
art and life.
Art and life. There you go. There you go. Professor, we're going to eventually continue our discussion on poverty because it was put on the front burner in the popular consciousness in 2018 at Buxton when you unveiled the Buxton proposal. It's been 5 years. And I think in that time, we've been able to put poverty on the front burner in a very practical way so that the ordinary people can relate to what we are talking about, related to their lived experiences, related to the larger economy. But let's start with something that we've been talking about here over the last couple of weeks, and that is the auctioning of the 14 oil blocks. It seems as if the volume of bids that were expected was somewhat low. Your response to that? Are you surprised? What's happening there?
To be truthful, I have always felt that the reporting on it has been extremely naive and self-serving of certain interests, which I think do not augur well for Guyana. There's a lot of noise and nonsense which tries to create the impression that Guyana is somehow or the other given away its oil and gas wealth without due considerations for what benefits will come to Guyana itself. There have been 5 studies, as far as I know, that have been done to estimate the share of the net cash flow from the oil and gas projects that we have signed on to, for which we have contracts. 3 of them have been done by non-profit organizations of considerable repute, and 2 of them have been done by private sector for-profit organizations of some considerable repute as well. The 3 non-profit organizations are the Inter-American Development Bank, the University of Trinidad and Tobago, and Open Oil, which is its largest single, I think, oil NGO operating in a way that may be sympathetic to countries like Guyana, who are struggling to establish oil industry. 2 of them have been conducted by the 2 most eminent research firms in the field. One is Rystad Energy, and the other one is Wood Mackenzie. And those 5 studies show that the range of the share of net cash flow that comes to Guyana falls between 51+% and 60%. So the median or even the simple average that flows to Guyana falls within the median distribution that goes to countries. So on that scale, Guyana is doing fairly well as the average country in the world. Certainly, if we were to apply the American standard to Guyana, yield of the net cash flow would only be 40%, because that experiment has also been done. So even though there are limitations in the PSA that we have, the contract, the production share agreement, the limitations are not so severe as to move it away from the global average. And that is why even organizations that have been critical of Guyana in the past have had to withdraw their apologies for all the criticism they made, and to acknowledge that what has happened by sheer happenstance, that China is getting a return on the oil sector that is comparable with global returns. The feeling, however, has grown, and the government has taken it on, that somehow or the other that we are being severely cheated. And one of the objectives behind going to the public auctions was to remove any criticism that this may be because we were offering the opportunity to exploit oil and gas in Guyana at too cheap a price. So they auction off the blocks to let the bidders compete for the oil blocks, and to get a better price if possible. So those blocks that have been applied for will provide a better price than those that existed before. But because the feeling was given that the price was so low relative to the rest of the world, the impression had grown that once you go to public auctions, we swamped with bids. As it turned out, only 8 of the 14 blocks were bid for. That is why I'm conducting a social experiment in my Sunday Stable columns by taking stock of the state of the industry just prior to the auctions and see what will eventuate after the auction in terms of the price return, the cash flows, and so forth that we get for the new set of PSA. Suspect it won't be significantly different. And the simple reason for saying that is that we know that Exxon bid, and Exxon is the one that leads different operations under the existing PSA. So they know what price is a realistic price to expect out of the oil blocks that we have as potential. So I imagine that has been a sobering experience for those who have been flouting the idea that Ghana has been savagely exploited in terms of the PSA when compared to what we should get if it were open to competitive bids. But of course, we supported the bids in the WPA because the second reason for having bids is also important. By having bids, we try to give some transparency to the process of selling the oil blocks or renting them or getting into contract for their operation. So that transparency would probably remove any significant doubt about whether or not there have been underhand dealings. But that we don't know, because as you've seen, as we discussed in our earlier considerations of the oil blocks, there can be collusion in the oil blocks.
Yes.
From the firms that are bidding, I don't know about. And I doubt whether they have the capacity to undertake or the technology to undertake offshore operations at a significant type. All the bidding so far has been in shallow waters. Well, primarily, I think of the 8, I think 6 or 5, I'm not sure, are in the shallow waters. So that might give an idea of the leanings in the capacity of the firms. Because the offshore technology has been largely in the hands of the leading oil explorers' hands. And Exxon has been a major leader because they have explored the technology, exploited, developed it, and so forth, and hold a lot of patents that give them rights to operate it. So I'm not surprised that they are going to bid again, because it does convey the impression that contingent to the blocks that they are operating at present, there are other blocks that may be yielding significant potential benefits. So that's how I would read it. I would say that we learn as we proceed. So I hope that those who are running the industry are learning the lessons from this particular experiment in oil block auctions. Mm-hmm. The announcement will not be made until the end of the year.
Right.
So we have some time for that. I hope no significant collusion will be taking place, because that's the single biggest threat in oil block auction. Mm-hmm. That the parties bidding are colluding so as to undermine the authenticity of the auction. But we won't know that until well into next year.
We noticed at least one company from the Middle East has bid, and there's been a lot of activity from the Middle East, a lot of visits.
I think the government will also carry on private, as they've indicated, private negotiations, because they're still allowed to do that, even though they have the auctions with Middle Eastern and I think they hinted at Indian companies to see if they can also work out deals. Mm-hmm. But what you have to understand is that there might be among that group companies bidding who are going to try to get property rights over the blocks to flip them, not because they have a capacity to exploit by exploit, I mean generate the exports. Like there's one, I don't want to single it out for a very good reason. I don't want to be suspicious just because of the persons who come together for the bidding, but they refer to them as a group of business women. I don't know if it's from Guyana or where, and I don't want to single out because it's women. But a group like that could be a potential group that's trying to get a sort of property ownership in the blocks that they can flip somewhere down the road.
So just as they flip houses, you can flip oil blocks.
Yeah. They were trying to do that from the very inception.
Oh wow! Yeah, I'm learning some things here.
Bits that involved bilateral negotiations.
So there is no
flipping.
There is no regulation that.
Well, there was no regulation against buying property and selling it.
But could there be regulations?
Well, the regulations in the auction should make it that the bidding forms demonstrate the capacity. I don't know how that is defined in the auction. So they should demonstrate categorically the capacity, both in terms of access to technology, access to funds, access to the labor skills, and all those things to make it possible.
You did mention the group of women. Is there, when you went through the list, the 8 bidders, is there any Guyanese company that has put in a bid there?
Well, I won't recognize it. That group could be a Guyanese.
All right.
And then the number 2 group listed.
Right. Okay, we shall see. You said that we have up until the end of the year before all of this is, comes together.
Yeah. Because they have to study the bids. They have to make a decision. I think by that time more information will flow. We know more about the groups. I find myself to start some due diligence search to find out who they are. At the moment, I'm not very clear where the Middle Eastern groups stand. They do refer to them, one Arabian company, and whether they are there with other groups from the Middle East or whether they're independently. But the initial descriptions, the initial description, I should say, does not clarify the details of any particular consortium or consortia among the bidders. So that's one thing that we have to establish, that the bidders may in fact have a consortium among themselves, some of them.
Yeah, Professor
So
Clive
they couldn't
Thomas.
tell from just the name.
Right. Professor Clive Thomas here talking about the recent auction of the oil blocks. 8 of them. We've had 8 bids, and as Professor Thomas has said, that what we ought to be doing now is doing due diligence, checking out these companies to see who they are, what their backgrounds are, and so forth. So those of you who are in this kind of business, please share with us information. Please share with us information, because I know lots of you in the audience pay attention to this issue. You can forward information to us that you think is important as we go through the process. Professor Thomas, let's turn our attention. The IMF sent a team down to Guyana, what they call a team of staff members, and they have published a report on their findings. They are projecting the continued heavy growth in the GDP. I
Yeah.
think they say an average of 20% between 2024 and 2028. They are projecting unemployment, which stands at about 12.4%, to go down steadily. But the big bombshell was the recommendation that we review our exchange rate. Now, obviously, that's a complex issue. So, first of all, talk about their projections for the GDP, and then your comment on the projection for unemployment to go down, and then finally, your thoughts on the review of the exchange rate. Should we review the exchange rate? What are the benefits? What are the downsides?
On the first issue, I think given the oil discoveries and given a rapid continued growth in GDP, at least into the 2030s. And that has already been baked into the projections by institutions who have been reviewing Guyanese experience. I mentioned the Inter-American Development Bank that had done one of the important estimations of government take from the oil fields. And they had projected rapid growth to early 2030s with a little bit of a halt in the growth as new fields had to be explored after the fields for the first 10 or more wells had been that had been announced so far, or had been announced at the time they were preparing the report in 2020, had been already announced as being set in train, because they would have 10, 12 floating platforms, floating storage and oil platforms, FPSOs, established by the early 2030s. And then there's a little bit of a dip in the growth of the GDP as the construction activity phased out. We reach about 1.1 to 1.2 million barrels a day, and we taper into the newer construction of wells in different parts of the offshore, and we start another round of growth going forward. But having to project more than a decade into the future, it makes sense continuing that type of projection because there are too many risks and too many variables involved. So we know from that initial experiment by the IDB that somewhere in the 2030s there'll be a slowing down at the rate of oil exploration of new wells taper down, but it will pick up again at the new phase of well construction and oil exploration shifts upwards, displaces the exploration curve upwards. So we expect a renewal of that growth going forward. But the thing that is important for us from the poverty point of view is that, as we have discussed here, and I have tried to show in my Sunday articles, is that the window of opportunity for oil, crude oil, oil with greenhouse gas emissions, is, in my estimation, clearly assured to the 2050s, but not yet beyond that. Although the signs are that not enough will be done to make that window of opportunity to the 50s decline and become smaller eventually become larger. So my best bet is that instead of 2050, we're more likely to shift to 2060s, 70s going forward. So Guyana's window of opportunity now for gas is more than, in my estimation, more than 2 decades and a half away. That is to early 2050s. That was the projection that they were using. And I also tended to support the UN expectation that renewables will overtake fossil fuel oil by the 2050s. But I do not think that that replacement will be an easy replacement. I feel the fossil fuels industry, if faced with a threat to their dominance, has the option of reducing prices and then engage in a struggle for long secular decline, which could last, to my mind, even outlast our patience and fossil fuels revive again. The reason for saying that is that it's not easy to replace a primary fuel like carbon emissions, oil and gas, carbon emitting oil and gas. It's not easy. It's not a simple plug and play. We see it now in the struggle to get electric cars into production. While we might switch the technology, we're not sure that we're switching to become more efficient in the use of carbon fuels, carbon emitting fuels. We're not sure that constructing the batteries and all this sort for the rare elements, rare earth elements required to make the batteries work, and all the investments that are going into the electric cars, all the outage stations and all that, will not require more power to make them a feasible framework for running a motor car industry as a primary means of transport that uses less fuel net. Because even if the fuel use is not directly in the car, it may also be used up in the construction of all the various things that you have to do to construct the batteries to replace the car and sustain battery use instead of oil use. And to sustain more use of vehicles, given the fact that you feel they're not damaging the environment. That might take place, more intensive use of vehicles. That might take place now in an atmosphere where people try to economize on the use of carbon emitting fuels. That case has not been made. So we have a long way to go. It's not a simple plug, pay a plug out the electricity from one channel or one outlet and go to another. It's not an easy switch over.
Right.
So I figure that although I stick to the 2050s with the transition point, I would feel if I had to advise Guyana, and I was doing it from the point of view of our national interest, I would treat the 2050s as a certain decade in which we could still find a competitive solution for any oil that we find.
Would you? Go ahead. I thought you were finished.
No, well, I would just go to add a point that my estimation is that we have about 25 billion barrels of oil, which is more than twice what we are announcing now. And the government did announce 24 billion as a means of tempting bidders. I should not say that they did that for that reason, but they've announced 24 billion. So even though nobody shares my projection, which has been given now for years, more and more there's evidence that people are creeping towards that figure. Because if the government is going to say 24 billion, they're going to lie now and a bid to bidders and then they go back and sue them. giving false information.
Yeah. So, would you recommend an adjustment in the exchange rate at this time?
No. And that is for a defensive reason. You probably heard everybody when they talk about oil. I always talk about what they call the Dutch disease.
Yes.
That is the fear that the exchange rate may become appreciated and make the non-oil economy an uncompetitive sector as compared to the oil sector, and where opportunities for sustaining the non-oil economy dwindle. And that will happen principally through the rise of the exchange rate. And if anybody is going to talk about an adjustment in the exchange rate in Ghana, I'm sure they're going to be wanting to move in the direction of appreciating the exchange rate.
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, it fell from the early days when it was 2 to 1 and then 1 to 1, from 1 to 1 to 2 to 1, 10 to 1, 20 to 1, all the way down to 210. Already we find that for just sheer convenience, vendors are using 200 to 1, which I myself would not encourage. Because once you begin psychologically to appreciate the exchange rate, and that is only because of the convenience arithmetic.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of selling borrowed, say 1,200,
Sell it at
versus
2,000.
6 US, we sell for 12, because 6 by 2 is 1,200.
Right.
Whatever it is. And the easy multiplication. And for sheer convenience, we are appreciating the rate. I think that's a bad psychological effect. And I would hope the government would try to talk the population out of doing that. Because that premium is a significant premium, because it can be as high as 210.
So, Professor, be a little bit more graphic. If let's say we were to take the exchange rate down to, let's say, 100 for 1, how would that work negatively against us?
Well, could you imagine, let's say you're exporting sugar and you used to get, let's say for convenience, 200 to 1.
Uh-huh.
So I do it too. And you might multiply the 200 for every US dollar you get.
Uh-huh.
It means you have more local money than if the exchange rate goes down to 1 to 1.
Uh-huh.
So your capacity to manage the industry and to benefit from it is reduced. Guys who won't like to know its income is halved just because the exchange rate is half in local dollars. Because they deal primarily in local dollars to meet their expenses. And then they sell the sugar. So they don't want to sell the price when they turn it around in local dollars. They get less than what they could get.
I'm pressing you a little bit here because that's interesting, because psychologically we have come to believe that the higher the exchange rate,
stronger the country.
Yes.
That in a sense is true too. But also remember that the rate was devalued because that was to make our exports in the traditional sectors competitive. It's because we could convert $1 to 205 or 208 or whatever it is for every dollar we earn in rice. That is efficient for the rice farmer to continue producing rice.
Mm-hmm.
But if you reduce that, he'll have to think twice whether he should be in rice. Because the appreciation rate will move faster than his income will grow from just expanding production.
So do you think that at any time in the short to medium term that we would adjust the exchange rate?
I think we need to not adjust it. We need to have an foreign exchange rate regime.
Uh-huh.
Or we fixing it now? is based on a type of situation which doesn't prevail now. How we set that up prior to the discovery of oil. So the question we have to ask is, with the discovery of oil, what is the best mechanism to use? So we have to take into account all the interests from the different points of view.
Yeah.
And that study needs to be done before you make a decision. I would like to say offhand what's the best regime for us to use. It should be studied. That's what I'm saying, rather than drifting to some external agency suggesting what is convenient for them and not necessarily convenient for us.
That's convenient for us. Professor, let's switch to poverty, because the last program we ended there, and I want to ask you a couple of practical questions. All right, so the poverty rate is quite high. Some people are projecting that it's about 50%. When you take into consideration people who are working for $5 or less per day. Now, obviously, it's a process if we are going to reduce poverty. Where do we start? If you were advising the government of Guyana, where do we start this process? If we all agree that we are going down that road.
We should start the process at the point of measurement.
Okay, good.
We need to have a precise idea of what it is that constitutes poverty, how we care to define it, and the extent to which it is there. And then secondly, we need to have a mechanism for monitoring it. You shouldn't leave it to haphazard information, data being delivered to us by different people and different institutions. For example, we have the Oxford Poverty Center, the World Bank, the UNDP, the IADB. All these agencies giving us different estimations of poverty. They don't all use the same methodology. But I would say that the agency that is best suited to us is the United Nations Development Program, because they've been the most consistent. They're the ones that developed the Human Development Report, have been consistent over the years, and they've structured all their development programs around their innovations and the poverty measures. So I would, first of all, get some consistency, and I would rely on the UNDP. Now, the UNDP has recognized its leading role from 2 points of view. First, it constructs the Sustainable Development Goals, and it monitors it. So they are, I would say, by miles, the leading exponent of what poverty is at a global and country level. Second, they have adopted all their collective global effort around as a primary objective, the eradication of poverty. And that is consistent with what we are also proposing in the Buxton proposal, that we use the opportunity to remove all evidence of monetary poverty in the region and in Guyana as a primary consequence or the primary outcome from this discovery of oil and gas, that we make that a priority movement. Now, independent of this effort, poverty has been reducing because the sheer pressure or the sheer gains that you get from the rapid growth in GDP has been reducing the numbers of people who live below the poverty line. That is having an effect independent of what effort you may have at steering it in that direction. But if you steer it in that direction, the reduction could be rapid. because the UN has proved that at a global level, because global poverty has reduced substantially. Remember, if you can remember, 20 years ago, probably the biggest body of poor people were the Chinese in the
Right.
world. No, you don't talk about them in poverty. So you could see what the pressure of growth can do, what the benefits of expansion in GDP can bring to country, independent of any effort you make. So that if you make the effort, you can also, in cases like ours where the poverty is persistent, link this to the colonial structures and to colonial activities, sugar and all that. The effort to really reduce poverty can be made to be very fruitful in relatively short periods of time. But monetary poverty disappears from the social fabric and we begin to use resources to multiply the capacities of the people that we have who are no longer stressing themselves out from the restraints or the constraints or the deprivations of poverty. So that is the one where you want to go.
And that point is very important that you're making there, and I want to underscore it because of the propaganda of the government. The government keeps telling us that a lot of the positive changes we are seeing has to do with their intervention. And as I hear you here, is that you're saying there are some things that will change whether you put there's input from the government or not.
Yeah.
And your point there about poverty, the reduction of poverty, without any direct intervention from the government, I think is very instructive.
Yeah, but it's too slow. That's the criticism of it.
Right,
Too
right,
slow and it takes unnecessary time. And it causes unnecessary human suffering.
yeah.
And just because we know that, we should make it an expeditious um, event that we have to overcome in as short as possible period of time. We don't want to be paying out universal benefits to people. We want them to be able to go into workforce and earn it so they can earn the incomes that they deserve. But so if we want to do it rapidly and to reduce the scourge of poverty, we have to act rapidly. We can't leave it to the population because they need the government help, the government support, the institution of the state to make it a feasible project that can be accomplished in the shortest possible time period. Poverty is not a luxury you can afford to take your time over. It's like an acute illness of society. And you have to treat it with the same urgency as you would do with any acute illness. You don't wait until tetanus overcome the whole body to start to give it antibiotics or whatever it is.
Yes, and in that calypso there by Shadow, he talks about poor people, impoverished people always having dreams.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
they talk about what they dream of. They dream of a house, they dream of this, they dream of that. And I think that is so consistent with the argument that you've been making, that if the government intervenes in a really active way in trying to reduce poverty, and for example, our proposal for cash transfer, structured cash transfer, and pushing back against the argument that if you were to give people structured cash transfer, they would use the money in an unstructured way and they would spend it on drugs and so on and so forth. And I think that stanza there by Shadow, where he says, poor people are always dreaming dreams and the things they dream about. I found that quite instructive. Professor, you are about to revise or update the Boston proposal. Why?
Well, I still find it personally really disappointing that up to now, we can't convince people that you should not despise poor people by telling them that the government is giving them handouts. When they give these same handouts, these same tax benefits to their cronies and friends and their drinking buddies, and you don't even notice it. You treat it as the regular hands to help you up that you expect the state to do for the private sector. They do it for business all the time. Nobody thinks twice about it. As soon as you hear poor people involved, all the moralists bust it. And I find that I was hoping that Guyanese were, as I believe, the most radical populace in any part of the world because they accept the most radical solutions readily, whether it be land reform, whether it be UBI programs and things like that. I think the generality of the population accepts it more readily than anywhere I've ever read about or been to. I think that radicalism of the population is to our benefit, and we should use it and encourage it and hope that we find enough people to help to give a hand to try to bring the scourge of poverty to an end. And we find how easy it is and how much better we live if we don't have to bother about the poor that is around us all the time, begging for handouts, begging for hands up, begging for any sort of assistance, and be taking our time over delivering it. That is what I think we have to fight against.
Professor, the press, you hinted at this, but I want a more fulsome comment from you. The president, in an interview with the BBC, disparaged handouts, but the government itself over the last 3 years, against the advice from yourself, from the WPA, from others, that this thing about going around the place and just giving people little handouts here and there, it's not good enough. The government has pursued it, they have defended it. Yet here is the president telling the BBC it's not a good thing. What do you make of that contradiction?
When they play into the prejudice. They don't want to admit that they give handouts to the business sector. Would expect to vote for them. I would expect to keep up the walls of political support. I do that all the time for that class. And it is our fault that people come to accept that as the norm. We don't shout down against it. Once we hear help to business people, we think of modernity, we think of ways how they can employ people, we think of the ways how they can reduce technology, we think about all the positive things that they can do. But when we say we give it to our poor, we don't think of all the positive things that that does too. I'm not against helping industries that are weak to compete in a world where we are weak in terms of the quality of our business class. But we have to also recognize that the poverty among us has to be addressed with the same consistency. We can't use two different sets of standards and play into prejudice, which there is against anything that goes to poor people. He's talking to a welcome audience because they'd like nothing more than to believe, oh, those third-world people, all they can do is give themselves benefits and pat themselves in the back. They don't know the discipline of work. That's what they tell plantation workers. They don't know the discipline of work.
Professor, one of the things that you have championed, not just in this era, but throughout your career, and that is loosely democratic distribution of resources. And the Buxton proposal itself is grounded in that democratic distribution, that fair and just distribution, the giving the same amount of money to each household. You can't get more equitable and democratic than that. Recently, Nigel Hughes presented a study about roads in Region 5, and he was making the argument of unequal. Let me play something, play a responsive from Vice President Jagdeo, and then get your comment as we close off.
One simple vision hack anyone can use to improve vision, so you can say goodbye to your optometrist for good. You know,
I saw Nigel Hughes yesterday posting about Region 5 allocations, about how many roads are done and how many are in African communities and how many in Indian communities. So of 8 roads, he pointed out the one is in the Indian community. One community, 23 roads are being done, and maybe 7 in the Afro communities. There are more than 1 Indo-Guyanese communities in Region 5. So maybe they would complain that Bush Slot is getting too many roads and they're not getting any at all, because at least some villages are getting some roads here that are Afro-Guyanese and mixed villages. The issue is that we don't do the ethnic count when we decide on capital works. We have made it clear we're fixing all the roads, community roads in the entire country, particularly along the coast. It's just a matter of time when we get to every community.
drinking water.
Professor, is that an adequate response?
Well, not as far as I'm concerned. No, it's not adequate. I mean, it is true you want to deal with every problem at the same time, but problems have different levels of urgency in different communities. And what a government has to do, as he clearly knows or should know, is to establish the priorities by which they try to meet the identified urgency of the need. If you were running a well-constructed government, you would know which areas these roads are more urgently needed than others. And if you want to ensure that the distribution of the benefits follow a pattern that is not subjective, it's not based on your whim or fancy, but follows basic economic logic or science, you conduct socio-economic analyses that target the priority distribution areas. And you publish the results so people will know that this is not the product of somebody in a room making a decision. It's a calculated scientific approach to the problems that was at hand. And this is such basic ABCI, you don't understand it. And then the response is so arrogant. It shows the government not caring about people, we're only caring about defending its authority. And assuming that everybody must assume that everything that comes from the government is right. Not everything that does is right. That does it right. And people should be sharing in the distribution of these ideas as regards how equity is achieved within the society. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, the letters, I saw it. You probably saw it as well because it's widely circulated.
Yes.
That should not be the subject of an attack press conference or sarcasm by way of attack, sniping by way of attack. That should be the subject of serious discussion and involvement with people, how we understand, because some people interpret that this aggregation, because many of them have called me as maybe something useful we should think about. Is the difference between creative government and bully government.
What a way to end our program, Professor. There's a difference between creative government and bully government. There's a difference between creative government and bully government. Professor Clive Thomas, thanks again for coming through on another edition of The Open Word, our Politics 101 podcast on a Monday evening. Thank you much.
Thank you.
Wow. There's a difference between creative government and bully government. It came out. 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 And that is why I'm saying to us, we have to distinguish ourselves as a Guyanese people, as a people who are thinking progressively. Thomas said something that I hope is not missed by the audience here tonight, that we are perhaps one of the most radical populations in the world. I had never thought about it, perhaps because I'm Guyanese and I don't know. But as he said it, I began to look back. And the way in which our society embrace radical and progressive ideas, even during the Cold War, when it wasn't fashionable, we, in Guyana, the Guyanese society in itself pushed a lot of our political parties in progressive directions. I hope that is not lost on you. I mean, as he said, as he's been reading and studying societies across the world, our societies perhaps the most radical or among the most radical. You all think about it. Think about it. Because often we think that we've got to go and knock down the door. We are already a progressive population. Progressive ideas have never. I spent the last couple of minutes thinking about it. How many progressive ideas, wherever they came from, whether they came from the PPP, the PNC, the WPA, whether they came from our scholars, our activists, our society has never, certainly in the post-emancipation, post-colonial era, and it has to be before then, we've never really kicked out of the park progressive ideas. I want us to think about it, because that is the direction we have to go. We have to make the most of the manna that is falling, not from heaven, but falling and coming from the oil. And it is the progressive ideas that we put on the table that will determine whether those revenues, those resources lead to outcomes that are democratic, that solve real problems. The government has decided it's going to spend money on infrastructure. A lot of money, all the money, most of the money on infrastructure. Is that the way to go? Spending on infrastructure obviously is important. But as somebody, I think Sherwood Lowe, who said in a letter that spending on people, this government seems not to have that as part of its vision. It is part of our vision. We in the Working People Alliance, we are very clear that we have to spend on the physical infrastructure of our country, but we have to spend on the human infrastructure. That's spent on people equally, if not more. And that comes from a place ideological place. It comes from a vision of where we want to see our society. It would be nice. It would be nice to live in a Guyana where poverty is reduced. You know how much will change if poverty is reduced? We walk around the place and we see our fellow citizens begging on the street corner. And, you know, it pains us. Can you imagine driving in Georgetown or along the coast and not seeing an army of beggars? Just think about it. I'm just giving that as one example. If we were to deal with those of us who live overseas and have to send barrels, and these days not barrels so much, but send money to help families at home. Do you think about what the difference it would make if that burden is reduced from you? Because people are catching hell in New York and Toronto and wherever they are, Barbados. And they have to look out for their families who are impoverished in Guyana. Think if that burden is reduced, how it would help you in New York and Toronto and wherever else you are in a personal way. Just some thoughts as to why we have to pursue real progressive ideas. Real progressive ideas and implement them. That is why we are trying to get Professor Thomas to speak to us on these issues. I want to thank you all for coming through. And tomorrow night, I'm going to see you all. I think tomorrow night I have Aubrey Rettmeyer, who worked at SARA and has been writing some letters in the newspaper, weighing in on issues. He was here about a year ago. He'll be here tomorrow night, and we'll be talking about politics and everything political with Aubrey Rettmeyer, the former CEO at SARA, a member of the PNC, a former soldier, worked in, as I said, the Granger government, and he'll be here tomorrow night. So until then, I want to thank you again and to say how much we love you. Love is key to what we do.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we woman and we children. That must be the ambition.